They say religion saves, that it uplifts, redeems, purifies. But Machiavelli knew better. He saw what no one dared name, that faith could be used like a knife, clean in appearance, silent in its damage, and always pointed downward. He wrote not as a cynic, but as a witness. Centuries ago, before psychology gave language to manipulation, and before politics unmasked its gods, Machiavelli exposed the quiet machinery behind devotion. This is not an attack on belief, it is a reckoning with how belief has been used. And Machiavelli warned us, we just didn't listen. When Machiavelli looked at religion, he didn't see angels or salvation, he saw architecture. Towers built not for worship, but for surveillance. Rituals not for the soul, but for submission. In a world where kings ruled land and popes ruled eternity, he saw that the most dangerous weapon was not the sword but the sermon. Faith was the perfect disguise for power because it asked no questions. It didn't shout, it whispered. It didn't force, it framed obedience as virtue. Machiavelli lived in a time when questioning the church wasn't just heresy, it was suicide. And yet, quietly, in the margins of his writings, he dissected it with surgical calm. He noted how rulers aligned with religion, not because they believed, but because they understood its function. To be crowned by God meant your authority could not be touched by men. To be called holy meant your cruelty could be called necessary. Religion, to Machiavelli, was the most brilliant performance in history, one that made people beg to be ruled, made them fear their own minds, made them kneel before men in robes and call it humility. He did not argue that faith was evil, but he knew that when power touches anything, even holiness, it becomes a mirror for its worst instincts. He saw how the illusion of sacredness was used to silence rebellion, how rituals were turned into routines of control, how salvation was offered in exchange for silence. And so, in his quiet pages, he wrote a truth few dared admit. Religion, in the wrong hands, is not the path to heaven. It is the mask power wears while it builds its throne. Machiavelli watched as men bowed not from love, but from fear, dressed as reverence. The bells tolled, the incense rose, the robes swept stone floors, and underneath it all was a quiet transaction no one spoke of. Faith was not something gifted freely. It was extracted, shaped, installed like stone into a wall that would someday close around you. From childhood, belief was not a question. It was a script handed to you before your mind could think for itself. You were baptized not because you chose to believe, but because your silence was convenient. You were told stories of eternal fire before you learned how to read. You were warned about forbidden thoughts before you ever formed your own. This was not enlightenment, this was programming, and Machiavelli understood it long before psychology existed to explain it. He saw that belief was not won through miracles, but through repetition. The same hymns, the same prayers, the same stories played over and over, until doubt sounded foreign and obedience felt natural. To believe, in Machiavelli's time, was not a sign of spiritual awakening, it was a requirement of citizenship. And those who stepped outside the lines were marked not just as heretics, but as enemies of order, because religion was not only about God, it was about the state. The same men who preached humility from the pulpit were often the ones whispering into the ears of kings. The same hands that held crosses also signed orders for war. And the faithful followed, not because they were cruel, but because they were trained to trust. Machiavelli saw it for what it was, a quiet bargain. Give us your loyalty, give us your confession, give us your children. And in return, we will give you meaning, structure, and the illusion of protection. It worked not because it was holy, but because it was familiar. And anything familiar becomes sacred if repeated long enough. Machiavelli knew that no tyrant could control the masses with swords alone, but with scripture, the masses would control themselves. That was the genius. You could be ruled from the inside. You could be convinced that your fear was faith, that your silence was wisdom, that your suffering was divine. And because the rituals were beautiful and the churches so grand, few ever questioned the cost. But Machiavelli did. He saw that the price of faith, when imposed from above, was always your mind. And he asked the one question no priest dared answer. If your soul must be purchased through fear, was it ever yours to begin with? To Machiavelli, the most dangerous union in history was not forged by sword, marriage, or treaty, but by whispered agreement between the church and the crown. One ruled the earth, the other claimed the heavens, and between them nothing was left untouched. Machiavelli watched as kings stood beside priests, not out of devotion, but out of calculation. If a ruler had the church behind him, his cruelty became divine order, his wars became holy, his punishments became justice sanctified by God. This alliance was not built on shared faith, it was built on shared interest. The throne needed the church to bless its legitimacy. The church needed the throne to enforce its authority. Together, they formed a machine of influence so complete that resistance became heresy and obedience became worship. Machiavelli knew that power alone could not hold a nation. Fear could, but only for so long. What lasted longer was meaning. If you could convince the people that their suffering served a holy purpose, they would not only endure it, they would defend it. If you could convince them that their ruler was chosen by God, then rebellion was not only treason, it was sin. This was not politics. This was puppetry. And Machiavelli saw the strings. In his writings, he did not condemn belief, he condemned its abuse. He studied how sermons became tools of social control, how mass became ritual theatre, how kings learned to speak the language of salvation when they really meant submission. He watched princes kneel at altars before marching to war, not because they feared God, but because they knew their soldiers did. And when popes declared enemies damned, Machiavelli understood the game. It was not about souls, it was about leverage. He recorded how easily morality could be dictated from pulpits, how guilt could be installed like iron bars in the mind, and how faith became the most effective form of surveillance ever created. Because when people believe their thoughts are being watched by heaven, you no longer need guards. You no longer need laws. They will police themselves. They will silence their own doubts. They will offer up their own freedoms and call it righteousness. This was the genius Machiavelli saw, and feared not that religion existed, but that it had become inseparable from the machinery of rule. Not that people believed in God, but that rulers had learned how to weaponize that belief. And as he wrote in his dark little study, surrounded by the echoes of prayer and the clinking of coins in cathedral coffers, he penned a truth too dangerous to say aloud. The path to ultimate control did not run through the battlefield, it passed through the altar. Machiavelli understood something that most never dared say. Fear, when wrapped in holiness, becomes unshakable. It doesn't shout, it doesn't threaten. It waits, patient and eternal, behind stained glass and whispered prayers. He saw how religious fear was crafted not just with tales of hellfire, but with silence, ritual, and the suggestion that even your thoughts could betray you. Unlike political fear, which ends when the ruler dies, sacred fear lives forever. It's handed down through mothers and sermons, embedded in lullabies and funeral rites. You're taught not only to fear the punishment of God, but to believe that questioning anything sacred is the beginning of your damnation. That's the brilliance Machiavelli saw. Other rulers needed guards. The church only needed a candle and a story. Tell a man that a king will punish him, and he might rebel. Tell him that God will punish his soul, and he will surrender before he ever fights. He will kneel not because he was beaten, but because he was convinced it's noble to do so. That is how fear becomes sacred. Machiavelli dissected it with brutal clarity. He knew that fear must be invisible to endure, and in the hands of religion, it became the perfect ghost, always watching, always judging, always one sin away from eternal fire. No tyrant could dream of such reach. Even in sleep, the faithful feared their thoughts. And when fear becomes internal, it no longer needs chains. Machiavelli watched how those who controlled the afterlife controlled the present. A prince could command a city, but a priest, with the right words, could command generations. He saw how spiritual fear didn't just create obedience, it created loyalty. People didn't just follow, they thanked their captors. They wept in pews for the forgiveness of sins they were never guilty of. They begged for salvation from crimes they never committed, and they taught their children to do the same. That was the system Machiavelli feared most, not brute force, but gentle submission passed off as virtue. Fear had become the moral compass, and worst of all, it felt good. It felt righteous. That was the horror. A man who obeys out of fear knows he is oppressed, but a man who believes his fear is faith will call his oppression divine. And in that confusion, Machiavelli saw the perfect formula for domination. Not through whips or war, but through the invisible architecture of the sacred. Through fear that didn't feel like fear. Through submission that felt like salvation. And long before the rest of us saw it, he whispered the truth in ink. If you want to rule forever, do not rule the body, rule the conscience. In the quiet corners of stone chapels, behind carved wooden lattices and veils of incense, Machiavelli saw something that chilled him more than any battlefield confession. Not the act itself, but the system beneath it. He watched how the ritual was praised as holy, framed as cleansing, but understood what it truly was. Sanctioned surveillance disguised as salvation. To confess your sins was to hand over the map to your guilt. To kneel before a man and speak your darkest thoughts was to surrender your mind in exchange for a promise, a pardon that only the institution could offer. And in doing so, you revealed yourself completely. To confess was to strip yourself of power, willingly, again and again. And Machiavelli saw that this was no accident. This was strategy. In a time before police states, before mass communication, the church had built a network of whispers. Every fear, every betrayal, every forbidden desire was funneled through confessionals, documented in minds that never forgot. There were no chains, no torture devices, only the weight of your own words, recorded in the name of God. And what made it genius, Machiavelli noted, was that people wanted it. They begged to be cleansed. They rushed to expose themselves. They feared what would happen if they didn't. Guilt had become currency, and the church the only bank. Machiavelli knew this was not about forgiveness. It was about leverage. A ruler could threaten your life. A priest could threaten your afterlife. And that, he realized, was the more terrifying power. If a man confesses to lust, he can be controlled through shame. If a woman confesses to doubt, she can be watched. If a nobleman confesses to treasonous thoughts, he can be silenced without accusation because the fear of his own secret turning against him is often enough to keep him loyal. And the beauty of it all, it was voluntary. No sword forced you to the confessional. You went on your knees. You left believing you were cleansed, never realizing you'd been profiled. It was the perfect trap. Machiavelli did not need to read every confession to understand what the church had built. He only needed to see the fear in the eyes of the faithful, the trembling hands, the lowered gazes, the self-policing. This wasn't holiness, it was psychological warfare in robes. And as he put ink to parchment, he wrote what others feared to think. Confession did not free you, it tethered you to an invisible leash. And every time you whispered your sins into the darkness, someone was listening not to absolve, but to ensure you never stepped out of line again. To most, saints are symbols of purity. Martyrs are remembered as holy sacrifices. But to Machiavelli, these figures were not always chosen by heaven. They were selected by men, elevated or erased, not for their faith, but for their usefulness. He saw the cruel symmetry between sainthood and execution. Both were theatre. Both were political tools draped in divine language. One was lifted to inspire obedience. The other was destroyed to enforce it. And sometimes, Machiavelli noted, they were the same person depending only on who told the story. In the cities of his time, he watched as those who defied authority with too much grace were turned into saints after their deaths, only when they no longer posed a threat. While those who questioned doctrine too soon, too loudly, too cleverly, were burned alive with scripture on their lips. Faith was not the measure, it was timing. The church, in Machiavelli's view, did not fear heresy. It feared heresy that could spread. The thinker who stayed quiet might be spared. The thinker who drew crowds was doomed. And so the executioner's blade and the painter's brush moved in tandem, one to silence, one to sanctify, and both served the same purpose: control. Machiavelli understood that sainthood was rarely the reward of righteousness, it was the reward of being politically convenient to honor, just as martyrdom was often the punishment for being inconvenient to ignore. He observed how miracles were voted on, how canonizations were delayed or accelerated depending on the tides of power. Holiness, he realized, was not only a matter of virtue, it was a matter of narrative. If your death upheld the system, you were remembered in stained glass. If your life challenged it, you were turned to ash and forgotten. And in this game, the church became both judge and author. It decided which deaths mattered, which voices echoed, which names were sung. The rest were buried, not only in soil, but in silence. Machiavelli saw this machinery and wrote of it coldly, without illusion. He did not marvel at the halos. He studied the timing. He traced the politics behind the miracles. He asked, who benefits from this memory? Who loses when this woman is called a witch? Who gains when this man is declared divine? And in asking, he exposed a truth the faithful could not bear to face, that even holiness, when filtered through power, can become propaganda, that saints can be pawns, that executions can be sermons, and that the line between sacred and sacrificial is not drawn by God but by the hand holding the pen that writes history. Morality, we're told, is eternal, etched in stone, delivered from the heavens, fixed like stars in the night sky. But Machiavelli looked closer and saw something far more unsettling, that morality was often made, not discovered, designed, not divine. He understood that what people call good is not always aligned with virtue, but with convenience, not eternal laws, but temporary rules set by those in power to preserve their seat at the table. He saw how religion claimed to define right and wrong, yet the definitions bent and shifted depending on who needed protecting and who needed punishing. Mercy for the loyal, fire for the dissenter. And the people followed not because they were evil, but because they were taught to equate morality with obedience. When the pulpit said war was holy, it became just. When it said silence was noble, it became righteous. When it said suffering was sacred, the faithful stopped resisting it. Morality became a menu, curated by clergy, edited by rulers, and served as divine truth. Machiavelli understood the power in this. If you can shape the moral code, you don't need to rule by fear, you can rule by conscience. The people will discipline themselves. They will crush their own desires. They will condemn those who deviate not out of hatred, but out of sacred duty. It was brilliant. It was terrifying. He observed how behaviors once damned could suddenly be blessed if politically useful. How lying, war, or betrayal became acceptable, even noble, if done in the name of God. The same act, in the hands of an enemy, was sin. In the hands of the righteous, it was sacrifice. This was not ethics, it was theatre, and Machiavelli saw the set design. He watched how the church moved moral goalposts to control populations, to justify bloodshed, to protect alliances. And when challenged, it would say, "This is not our word, it is God's." But Machiavelli knew better. He knew that no divine being required this many edits. He saw that the ink on sacred texts was often second to the ink on royal decrees. He warned that when morality is built to serve power, it ceases to guide, it begins to bind. It no longer protects the weak, it preserves the system. And in his writings, he urged those who would rule to understand this mechanism. Not to believe in morality as fixed law, but as a tool to wield or to resist. Because once morality becomes manufactured, the difference between virtue and violence is not what you do, but who blesses it. And in that difference, entire kingdoms rise and fall. Machiavelli knew the most dangerous kind of obedience is the kind that feels like devotion. When a person kneels because they believe it is holy, not because they are forced, they do not resist, they worship their own submission. And that, he understood, is the deepest form of control. Political chains can be broken, but spiritual chains are kissed. In churches across Europe, he watched as men and women folded their hands, closed their eyes, and thanked the heavens for the very structures that kept them silent. They called it virtue, but Machiavelli saw the trap. If you could convince someone that obedience was sacred, you didn't need armies. You didn't need laws. You didn't even need to be present. People would silence themselves. They would police their neighbors. They would raise their children in the same fear, calling it faith. Religion, in this light, became the most efficient power tool ever crafted, not because it demanded loyalty, but because it taught people that loyalty was holy. Machiavelli understood that this obedience wasn't born from violence. It was taught through repetition, ritual, and guilt. From the moment a child could walk, they were led into cathedrals, taught to bow, taught to confess, taught that questioning was sin and silence was strength, not because it made them better, but because it made them manageable. Machiavelli wasn't surprised. He knew the mind was more easily governed than the body, and if you reached it early enough, with the right blend of fear and reward, you could make a person love their chains. That was the brilliance of it. The people didn't know they were submitting. They believed they were rising. They believed they were serving something higher. And in that belief, they became the perfect subjects, devoted, self-regulating, terrified of their own thoughts. Machiavelli wrote that the ideal citizen in a theocratic system is not the brave or the brilliant, it is the obedient, the one who follows without question, who accepts punishment as purification, who believes suffering is sanctified, because such a person will never rebel, they will never rise. They will stand at the foot of their own subjugation and call it grace. And Machiavelli, watching from the edges of the altar, saw how cleverly power had hidden itself. No whip, no threat. Just sacred symbols and sacred scripts. Just enough fear to keep people quiet. Just enough hope to keep them proud. And so he warned, not against belief itself, but against the systems that twist it. Against the rulers who use the language of God to build prisons of praise. Because when obedience feels like salvation, you'll never know you've been conquered. Machiavelli watched a world where the highest reward wasn't peace, it was compliance. Where salvation was offered not to the good, but to the loyal. Where heaven became the promise for those who obeyed, and hell was the punishment for those who asked too many questions. In his cold, analytical way, he saw the genius in it. Every system of power needs a reward, a reason for the people to endure suffering without revolt. Religion, he realized, perfected this. It promised eternal bliss, not to the brave or the wise, but to the silent, the obedient, the ones who bowed without demanding to see who was seated at the throne. What better way to maintain control than to convince people that freedom is dangerous and doubt is damnable? Machiavelli understood this inversion of values. He saw how the free thinker, the rebel, the philosopher, were not only exiled in life, they were condemned in the afterlife too. Questioning the system wasn't just disobedience, it became spiritual suicide. And so people learned to fear their own minds, to suppress their own logic. They learned to call their curiosity temptation and their conscience rebellion, all while being told they were loved. That was the true cruelty. Not punishment, but the manipulation of longing, the use of paradise as bait, and of damnation as leash. And the masses accepted it because the story was beautiful. Streets of gold, eternal joy, reunion with lost loved ones. It was all so comforting, so blinding. No one wanted to see the price, but Machiavelli saw it. He saw that the price of heaven in the hands of rulers was silence, and the cost of hell was independence. The man who obeyed every command without understanding it was called righteous. The woman who spoke too boldly, even with love, was marked as fallen. The thinker was cursed. The conformist was crowned. And so morality bent, not toward truth, but toward usefulness. Machiavelli knew this had nothing to do with divinity. It was design, a system that told you to betray yourself in exchange for eternity, a system that taught you to call your chains sacred, to fear the door marked freedom and worship the one marked safe. He did not mock those who believed, he mourned what belief had become. A performance rehearsed through centuries, a tool sharpened by kings and clergy alike, and above all, a weapon aimed at the minds of those who might have otherwise broken the pattern. He wrote it plainly: when power offers heaven to the quiet and hell to the honest, it is not your soul thereafter, it's your voice. Machiavelli knew that every movement needs a face, and every faith needs a prophet. But what troubled him was not the presence of these figures, it was how they were chosen. How often, behind the veil of divine inspiration, there stood something far more earthly, political need. A prophet could change a nation, ignite a war, legitimize a ruler, but only if their message served the right power. Machiavelli watched as spiritual leaders were raised, not always for their wisdom, but for their usefulness. Those who preached obedience were protected. Those who questioned power, even softly, were branded false and cast aside. He saw how the line between prophet and politician blurred how revelation could be scripted, how holiness could be staged. Because once a figure claimed divine authority, their words were no longer debated, they were followed. And that, Machiavelli understood, was the most dangerous power of all, not to command the body, but to claim the soul, to speak not as man, but as mouthpiece for the eternal. When a ruler speaks, people may listen. When a prophet speaks, they kneel. This is why Machiavelli treated prophets with suspicion, not because he denied the possibility of spiritual insight, but because he saw how easily it could be mimicked. How often faith was choreographed to move armies, silence dissent, or sanctify empire. A prophet with the right message became untouchable. A prophet with the wrong one, dead. He studied history not as myth, but as pattern. How prophets who served the state became saints, and those who challenged it were erased. How miracles conveniently appeared before battles. How visions aligned perfectly with the ambitions of kings. Machiavelli saw these not as coincidences, but as tactics. He understood that belief could be engineered, and that those who controlled the message controlled the masses. He warned that a ruler need not be moral, only appear so, and that a prophet need not be true, only convincing. The illusion was enough, because when people believe a message comes from God, they do not question its benefit to the state. They carry it forward, protect it, even die for it, never realizing they are serving a purpose older and colder than faith. Machiavelli's genius was not in denying religion, but in revealing its proximity to power. He wrote, not with bitterness, but with clarity. In a world where the divine is interpreted by men, truth can be sold, and salvation can be scripted. The prophet becomes the perfect vessel not for God, but for governance. And the people, hungry for certainty, rarely notice the difference. Machiavelli did not flinch from the ugliness others preferred to decorate. He saw what so many refused to admit. That religion, while dressed in white robes and gold altars, often carried blood in its sleeves. The rituals, the hymns, the soft candles burning at twilight, these were not lies, but they were a mask, a distraction. Because beneath the beauty, beneath the carefully crafted image of peace, there was a long and brutal history of control enforced through terror. Holy wars were not called wars, they were crusades. Executions were not murders, they were purifications. Torture was not cruelty, it was penance. And so long as the right language was used, the blade could fall guiltlessly. Machiavelli understood this game. He saw how the church did not need to lie outright. It only needed to rename the violence. When heretics burned, the faithful were told it was for the health of the soul. When entire villages were slaughtered in the name of conquest, it was said to be for God's glory. He watched as the faithful rejoiced over victories that left thousands dead, calling it divine justice. But to Machiavelli, justice that relies on silence and swords is not justice, it is theatre. And religion, he saw, was a master of staging. It could turn horror into holiness with a few carefully chosen words. It could make the screams of the condemned sound like music if the choir sang loud enough. What made it powerful was not that it used violence. All rulers use violence. What made it exceptional was that it convinced people the violence was sacred. That is what chilled him. The belief that cruelty was not only necessary but holy, that to oppose it was to oppose God. This was not just power. This was power with immunity. Machiavelli saw how the church was rarely questioned, not because it was pure, but because it had made questioning feel like sin. It hid its darkest acts behind sanctuaries and scripture. It bathed in the blood of its enemies and called it wine. And when it was done, it offered forgiveness not to the victims, but to itself. That was the final cruelty, the ability to sin and absolve in the same breath, to kill and call it sacred, to silence and call it salvation. Machiavelli did not record these things out of hate. He recorded them out of clarity, because he knew that any institution which claims moral authority must be watched most closely when it feels most righteous, and when its hands are clean, but its history soaked. Someone must have the courage to say what others dare not whisper. That holiness, when unchecked, becomes the perfect place for cruelty to hide. Machiavelli never claimed that religion was useless. On the contrary, he considered it one of the most effective systems ever created, not for saving souls, but for organizing power. In his eyes, religion was not merely a belief system. It was a structure, a blueprint, a fully functioning architecture of influence that reached deeper than any law, lasted longer than any army, and governed not just behavior but thought. And what made it so powerful was not that it was enforced, but that it was believed. That is what fascinated him. Most forms of control require effort, coercion, surveillance, force. But religion, when fused with politics, made people complicit in their own domination. They weren't just following rules, they were upholding a worldview in which obedience felt sacred and punishment felt deserved. Machiavelli understood that such a system didn't need to be perfect. It only needed to be convincing. It needed a few sacred texts, a few rituals, a visible hierarchy, and an invisible threat. The rest would take care of itself. Because once people internalized the structure, they would protect it even in the absence of authority. They would teach it to their children. They would enforce it in their communities. They would destroy anyone who disrupted the order, not as a favor to the church or the state, but as an expression of their own belief. That was the brilliance. You didn't need to build a prison when you could teach people to fear freedom. You didn't need chains when they would chain themselves. And you didn't need to silence every voice when the people would silence each other in the name of righteousness. Machiavelli saw this clearly. He saw that religion offered more than comfort or clarity. It offered control at scale. It could be deployed across borders, across generations, and still hold its shape. It required no standing army, only faith. No violence, only the fear of damnation. He studied how leaders co-opted religion not because they were believers, but because they were strategists. They saw that the pulpit could accomplish what the sword could not, that sermons could create loyalty more enduring than any royal decree. Machiavelli did not write this out of cynicism. He wrote it as a warning. A system this powerful, he argued, must be understood if it is to be resisted or used. He offered no moral verdict. He simply traced the mechanism, and, in tracing it, he revealed a cold truth that still holds. When power wants to endure, it does not wear armor. It wears robes. It speaks softly. It promises eternity in exchange for submission. And those who follow it will not call it control. They will call it truth. Centuries have passed since Machiavelli wrote down his warnings in ink, but the patterns remain. The names have changed. The buildings are grander. The sermons are streamed instead of shouted from pulpits, but the blueprint he uncovered still holds. Power disguised as virtue, control disguised as care, and a public yearning for safety, meaning forgiveness, still kneeling, still offering their minds in exchange for peace. Machiavelli never mocked belief. He knew the human need to hope, to explain suffering, to believe there is something more than blood and borders. But he also knew that need, if left unguarded, could be hijacked, could be molded into a tool of obedience, so elegant it felt like devotion. That was the final, bitter irony. The more sincere the faith, the more perfect the control. And the machine doesn't need to be malicious. That's what makes it so effective. It only needs to reward loyalty, punish thought, and speak in a voice so familiar that you forget to question who is really behind it. Look around now, and you'll see the same choreography. Leaders invoking higher purpose to silence dissent. Institutions asking for trust without transparency. Scripts written long ago still repeated by mouths, too afraid to alter a single word. And even outside religion, the same tactics apply. Movements that demand belief without critique. Cultures that shame questions as betrayal. Machiavelli wasn't just writing about churches. He was writing about systems. Any system that trades your freedom for belonging. Any system that gives you identity in exchange for silence. He saw it first in altars, but he knew it would evolve, because the machinery of control doesn't care about robes or crosses. It only cares that you stop thinking, that you surrender the self. And so, we still kneel. Maybe not on cold cathedral floors, maybe not before stone statues, but we kneel in other ways, in fear of being cast out, in hunger for certainty, in silent agreement with things that make us feel small but safe. Machiavelli's work was never just a handbook for rulers. It was a warning for the ruled, a blueprint not only for how power functions, but for how it survives. It survives when people mistake submission for virtue, when questioning is labeled sin, when the cage is carved so beautifully you forget it's there. And so the question remains not whether religion is true, but whether you chose it freely. Not whether belief is powerful, but whether it is yours. Because Machiavelli knew what most still do not. The greatest trick power ever pulled was not forcing you to obey. It was making you believe you wanted to. If this opened your eyes to how power still hides behind virtue, you know what to do. Like, subscribe, and stay sharp. Because the systems Machiavelli exposed never disappeared, they just learned to smile while tightening the leash.